Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome. I'm Harold Holzer, Director of Roosevelt House at Hunter College, and on behalf of Jennifer Rabb, the President of Hunter, I'm delighted to welcome you here for this evening's discussion. As many of you know, Roosevelt House, of course, and Hunter College have long had a unique and almost palpable connection to Lyndon Baines Johnson and analyses of the Johnson years, just as the New Deal has a unique connection to the Great Society, of course. We all know, and we frequently mention, that Social Security and other key elements of the social safety net were first woven in this house during the period between Franklin Roosevelt's election and his inauguration, between November 1932 and March 1933. We may not know, and this is a story I wish I could illustrate, but the relic is not with us tonight. More planning, of course, more amelioration of the New Deal in 1936. And in April 1937, as our guest knows full well, Lyndon Johnson was elected to Congress in a special election in Texas. As soon as he was elected, he came to the White House to meet his hero, Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson came to meet his hero, Franklin Roosevelt. I'm sure Lyndon Johnson was also his hero, but in this case, he was meeting Franklin Roosevelt. There was, we calculate, at the White House at that moment, a giant double poster, a re-elect Roosevelt poster that had been signed by every Democratic member of the House and the Senate, along with the cabinet and President Roosevelt. We imagine, and we think this is reasonable, that Congressman Lyndon Johnson looked at this and said, why isn't my name on this poster? I mean, the answer was obvious. He hadn't been in Congress in 1936 when it was circulated. He added his name to the poster. We own it. We'll try to have it on view soon. He actually added it in a corner, Lyndon B. Johnson. When I showed it to Robert Caro, he said, I never knew this, but I believe it. Anyway, it's part of that tangible connection. Both presidents, FDR and Lyndon Johnson, were confident and smart enough to surround themselves with great bands of advisors, truly great staffs. And staff support is crucial to an administration, to policy, to communication, and ultimately to history. So who had the greater brain trust, FDR or LBJ, or for that matter, Abraham Lincoln, about whose gifted White House staff our special guest tonight has previously written? Maybe we'll get an answer to that question as well tonight. Roosevelt had Harry Hopkins and Robert Emmett Sherwood and others. LBJ had Jack Valenti, Joe Califano, who is speaking at Roosevelt House very soon, Harry McPherson, my friend Bill Moyers, quite a brain trust, quite an inner circle. And we, of course, at Hunter College some years ago had a conference exploring LBJ and his legacy, and one of the people who organized it and whose brainchild it was to explore that brain trust is Dean Andrew Polsky, the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Hunter College. We are delighted to have him here to conduct the conversation today with the gifted author Joshua Zeitz, a native of Trenton, New Jersey, a graduate of Swarthmore with a PhD from Brown, who has lectured at Harvard, Cambridge, Pembroke, and the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. So we can say that with his arrival at Hunter tonight, his education is complete. Along the way, he's written such books as White Ethnic New York, Jews, Catholics, and the Shaping of Postwar Politics. This is my favorite of his titles, I must admit. Flapper, a madcap story of sex, celebrity, and the women who made America modern. And then 4 years ago, the book to which I alluded a minute ago, Lincoln's Boys, John Hay, John Nicolay, and the War for Lincoln's Image, an intriguing book about how White House staff members not only influence policy decisions and carry out sometimes difficult instructions that impact on history, but also become invaluable eyewitnesses to history, history in the making, and shapers of history later that are based on their experiences. So it was for Nicolay and Hay, a number of Roosevelt brain trusters, and of course, LBJ staffers as well. Our guest also knows politics not only from the outside in, but from the inside out. And I think that's the right comparison. Because as part of his biography, as you'll see, in 2008, he was brave enough to run as a Democrat for Congress in a very red district in New Jersey. Well, you know he's here tonight, so he's not in Washington, but he ran a really brave race, and I'll bet he learned, as I did from politics, a lot that he can apply and does apply to his writing. So we are delighted that he's here tonight. As you know, the drill is that we will have a discussion followed by a question and answer period from the audience. We'll have a microphone to circulate to you for those, and then a reception and book signing. So please join me in conversation with Dean Andy Polsky, Joshua Zeitz.
Thank you, Harold, for that generous introduction. I'm pleased to welcome Josh Zeitz to Hunter College this evening and to welcome all of you as well. I want to say just at the start that this book, Building the Great Society, is a really terrific read about Lyndon Johnson, because I know I had to get through it in short order because I only had the opportunity to say yes to do this a few days ago. So I went through it, and it's really worth the while. And I know many of you, like me, remember Lyndon Johnson, and there are parts of this that will be a little bit familiar, but there's a great deal here, I think, that is new and different. Let me start with the question, what led you to write this book at this time?
So I was writing this book a few years ago and researching it a few years ago. Did not anticipate that it would come out roughly a year into a Trump presidency. I don't think anybody foresaw that. So,
least of all Trump.
Least of all Trump. That's exactly right. No, we were coming up on the 50th anniversary of the Great Society, and I think we already saw a fair amount of reconsideration and revisitation of Johnson's legacy, which had been badly tarnished by Vietnam. And so it seemed to me the right time to do a reappraisal. Many of the men, they were mostly men, it was the early 60s, many of the men who worked for him had already passed away. Some of that first wave of memory had disappeared, so it seemed like a good time to go back in and mine those sources from a new perspective, and also draw on some of the incredible scholarship that's been done over the last 30 years on the formation of the American welfare state, on political culture in the post-war period, on political culture and the rise of conservatism in the 1970s. So there was a lot of fertile ground there, and you could write volumes on this. Caro is.
Yeah. You tell a story of a president and, let's say, his inner orbit. Take a few minutes in this solar system around Johnson's. Let's start by talking about the sun in this solar system. Lyndon Johnson. What about him stands out for you?
Well, I mean, Johnson is everything that you think he is. He was a larger-than-life character. He could be incredibly crude, incredibly abusive. At the same time, he could show great flashes of generosity to the people around him. There was within him a core liberalism and concern for people who had been left on the edges of society that's undeniable. And yet he was a very complicated person to work for, live with, be around. He was consumed by ambition, exhibited traits that today that's probably not right, traits that we would probably not want in a president, but that maybe surface in presidents. And I think one of his redeeming features, or best features, was that he realized the value of expertise, realized the value of drawing around him talented people, despite his sort of overarching presence and ego. He had a high tolerance for dissent among the people around him. He, solicited alternative ideas, and if you were a strong enough personality, he could leverage you and use you to good effect. So, but an enormously complicated character.
So you brought this up. Let me follow up on it. It's hard not to notice some similarities between Lyndon Johnson and Donald Trump. Yeah? Here are a few examples
Sure.
of how you describe Lyndon Johnson. Page 18, quoting George Reedy, and the crudeness of Johnson comes through in this, let me warn you. LBJ demanded loyalty, real loyalty. I want someone who will kiss my ass in Macy's window and stand up and say, boy, wasn't that sweet. All right. Second example, quoting a Newsweek writer about Johnson, the most accessible and yet the most thin-skinned of presidents. He encourages contacts with reporters and then reacts indignantly when their stories don't come out as pro-Johnson. And my favorite on page 131, again from George Reedy, Johnson was, quote, a man goaded by an insatiable need for public acclaim. Sound familiar? Given the similarities of character, what allowed Johnson to rise above his flaws?
He was all of those things, to be sure, but he was also an inveterate politician, and a very good one. And I think that he knew how to get incredible work and product out of people. He certainly was a master legislator. That's a narrative strain that we're all familiar with. And I guess in the parlance of today, he was results-driven. I mean, he had a certain burning focus, and he focused on politics and policy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. His staff, senior staff members would later say he had no outside interests. He didn't read much. I mean, he didn't read anything other than policy memos, and he read 300,000 words worth of them a week when he was president. So he was a serious consumer of policy, but he didn't read literature. He had no interest in film, didn't really particularly care for sports. When he was at his ranch, he really didn't do much other than drive around and occasionally hunt. But I mean, he had basically no interest in life outside of politics. So if you focus yourself that intently on one thing, the chances are you might be very good at it.
Now, a lot of this book is about the people that Johnson picked around him, and he picked some really quite extraordinary ones. Harold mentioned in the introduction, we could talk about just a few of them, Bill Moyer, Jack Valenti, and Joe Califano, who's well known to us at Hunter. Tell us a little about these key aides.
Sure. I mean, the book actually opens from the vantage point of Jack Valenti. Valenti was about 40 years old in November of 1963. He was a advertising and PR guy from Houston who knew Johnson socially. They had met at one of the events that Johnson sponsored for young businessmen in Texas. Became friendly with the Johnsons, married one of LBJ's Senate office secretaries, and he had been tasked with, as a volunteer, with advancing the trip, the leg of the trip that the President Kennedy and Vice President Johnson were taking in Houston. That went very well, and Johnson said, why don't you get on Air Force Two, come with me, fly to Dallas, and then come to Austin with me afterward for the last leg of the trip. And so he did. And he was about 10 cars back in the motorcade. And it was sort of through a whirlwind of circumstance, was told, by the Secret Service agents that Johnson wanted him on Air Force One. He wasn't sure why. Now, if you look at that iconic photo of Johnson taking the oath of office, on the far left corner, smushed against the wall of the plane, you'll see a very confused-looking Jack Valenti, who would later write, I had no idea why I was there. He went on staff having no political experience, but he became, Johnson really respected his intellect and his dedication. He became the appointments secretary, proved a very deft gatekeeper for Johnson, not just in terms of who got to see him, but also what information he consumed. It was Valenti who culled through probably 500,000 words of memoranda from staff within the White House and different departments every week and decided what should go before the president. And he was actually credited by quite a few other staff members for having really been a champion of the oddball idea. I mean, he really put in front of Johnson a wide variety of proposals and concepts. He was a little bit different from Bill Moyers, who was also on the plane that day. Moyers was an ordained Baptist minister, young guy, 29 years old. He had been a staff member on Johnson's Senate staff and on his 1960 presidential campaign. He later sort of jumped ship and worked at the Peace Corps in the Kennedy administration. He was advancing the Austin portion of the trip. And unlike Valenti, who was sort of an accidental, passenger on Air Force One, Moyers, who we know is this sort of elder statesman of PBS today, and he had always come across as this very young, earnest, religious man. He was also burningly ambitious. So the minute he found out what had happened, he chartered a plane, got himself to Dallas to Love Field, and got himself on that Air Force One to make sure he was there. He became the jack of all trades. In late '64, he became the de facto chief of staff. He was press secretary for 2 years. And he was in many ways, he was to Johnson for a time what John Hay had been to Lincoln. Johnson would call him sort of like a son, and they were extremely tight. But to your point about Johnson being a difficult character, at one point Moyers had a chronic ulcer because of the way that his boss treated him. There were others like Joe Califano, who had been a young attorney working on Robert McNamara's staff, who joined the White House in '65, knew nothing about domestic policy. He was a defense policy guy, but they tasked him with running domestic policy, and he became probably the most effective, White House counselor ever to hold that portfolio. The number of other people we look at, Harry McPherson, the White House counsel who had served on Johnson's Senate staff, who was probably the most even-keeled of all of them, and the one who absolutely refused to let Johnson get under his skin. He simply refused to take his phone calls at night, and Johnson rarely yelled at him because he knew that McPherson would just sort of shut down and not respond, and it didn't have the desired effect. But he was also a playwright, actually wrote a number of plays. So a bunch of these guys, you talked about George Reedy. He had been press secretary for a while and a long-time Johnson aide. If McPherson didn't allow himself to get flustered, Reedy did, and they had this stormy, tempestuous relationship over 20 years.
It would probably, I refer to them as planets in orbit around the sun, but that's it, in some ways creating a sense of an order that didn't really exist. This was a staff in which the people didn't have clearly defined roles. They shifted their roles. In that respect, not unlike FDR, I think, where he would favor somebody for a while and then move away and favor somebody else. He didn't want anybody to get a sense of being the most important among his aides. Why did was Johnson purposefully juggling people, or did he simply feel that he would get the best feedback from people by giving them broad briefs and letting them compete for his attention? Was there a method to this?
Oh, a couple things. There wasn't the same defined set of roles in a White House then as there would be in later years. The modern White House staff only came into existence around 1939 when the executive departments were reorganized. But generally speaking, most presidents just kept around them a number of utility players. There was sometimes a chief of staff, sometimes not. Oftentimes a press secretary, but otherwise, you sort of picked up your portfolio of responsibility and ran with it. Where he was very similar to FDR, though, was in his sort of dual or triple assignment of the same task or problem to multiple staff members. He and Roosevelt did that. They both did that, and it could often lead to a tremendous amount of chaos. It could also lead to a lot of cross-pollination and competition to see who could get it done best and first.
One of Johnson's first accomplishments, and one of the most extraordinary ones, was passing the Civil Rights Bill in 1964. He does this soon after Kennedy's assassination, and what stands out about that is that unlike what he did in 1965 and after, he didn't have an enormous congressional majority, and there was still tremendous, the Southern Bloc and the Democratic Party was still very powerful. Why was he able to succeed in 1964, early in 64, on measures that Kennedy hadn't been able to succeed on? The Civil Rights Act, the tax bill, the tax cut, the Office of Economic Opportunity, some of these early measures with very minimal legislative majorities.
Sure. I think one thing that's important to bear in mind, and I try to draw this out in the book, is that Johnson's reputation as this master of the Senate, this master legislator, that was a well-deserved reputation. But we tend to overcredit him for a lot of these accomplishments. A couple of things, if we're talking about the Civil Rights Act, really were decisive. One was Kennedy's assassination. There's an enormous groundswell of emotion. The public got behind Johnson in a way that it probably had not gotten behind the president in decades, probably since Roosevelt's reelection, and it wanted him to succeed. That gave him a certain moral authority, certainly helped him in clearing the tax bill through, although there was a lot of backstage politics there in terms of getting the budget under a certain number in order to satisfy Harry Byrd, the Senate Budget Committee chairman. But really it was Kennedy's assassination that furnished him with this, enormous goodwill. But then I think you have to also really credit what was going on the ground in 1964, which was really instrumental in getting that bill passed. One of the liberal lobbyists, Joe Rao, for the Civil Rights Act, later said that during those days in the spring of '64, when you were walking the corridors of the Capitol trying to round up votes, you couldn't turn anywhere without running into a collar. The religious community nationally mobilized in a way that was extraordinary, in some ways unprecedented, and they were targeting Northern Republican moderates, trying to pick up their votes, and a couple of wavering Democrats. The ground game that Martin Luther King and others kept up created a moment, really. So I think it's the moment, and it's the Kennedy assassination.
Okay. The Great Society was a term that was debated in the administration. There was also a debate about the focus of the program. And in that debate, you describe how the Johnson administration understood the problem of poverty in the United States in the 1960s. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, because it's a very distinctive moment in American history.
Sure. You have to transport yourself back to the sort of 2 decades after World War II. And then remember that this is in the context of the U.S. emerging from the Great Depression. In the 1930s, most economists and liberal policymakers assumed that capitalism was foundationally broken, and that this was going to be the permanent state of affairs, that you would have high permanent rates of unemployment, that you would have low productivity, that the economy would not function at full capacity, and that this was simply going to be the state of the world. And so liberals working in the 1930s really thought about remedies that were redistributive in nature. There was an assumption that the economy is a pie. The pie is not going to get any bigger. So the only way you make sure that people have enough to live a reasonably good life is to divide the pie into smaller pieces. That thinking kind of goes out the window by the late 40s and early 50s. This is the era of the post-war boom. It's an era in which increasing numbers of blue-collar workers enjoy things that would have been unimaginable in earlier decades. Defined benefits, pensions, employer-based health care, wages that were not only above a living wage, they vaunted people into middle class. This is the era of mass suburbanization, the 1950s consumer boom. The country was extremely prosperous. It was seeing annual GDP growth in the 4%, 5% each year, and there was this faith that experts had figured out how to manage the economy, keep it humming at full capacity, and do so with low inflation. And this was the great experiment that came out of World War II. And this was a pervasive faith for liberals and for liberal economists and policymakers in Johnson's day. So the assumption was, as Walter Lippmann put it in 1964, whereas we once would have thought we have to divide the pie into smaller pieces, now what we have to do is just keep growing the pie and furnish people who've been left behind with the qualitative measures that they need in order to capture opportunity in a booming economy.
That's an interesting term, qualitative. You distinguish between quantitative liberalism of the New Deal era and the qualitative liberalism of the 1960s. In what sense is it qualitative liberalism?
Sure. There was a debate in 1963 and 64 about what to do about poverty. There were some people in the administration who said that what poor people need is money, and we can give them money through various means. We can do New Deal era style make work projects that could be semi-permanent in basis, or we could create something like a minimum family wage, or a minimum family income, which you would essentially enforce by way of a negative income tax. It's the idea that would later be enshrined in the earned income tax credit, but it would have been much more aggressive, and it would have ensured that every American family had a certain base level income. So you either needed jobs to get income or you needed income. They rejected this idea out of hand, although it would be revisited a number of times over the course of the Johnson administration, because it didn't really compute in an era where you had this kind of wide-scale mass prosperity. So the qualitative measures they embraced instead included job training for people who had been displaced. Even then, there was a great amount of focus being given to displaced coal miners in West Virginia and Kentucky. Ohio, there was a great deal of attention being given to some of these small industrial cities in the Midwest, which were losing their good-paying union jobs. So you get job training, education, healthcare, so that people would be healthy enough to actually access the workforce. And of course, there was a focus on providing qualitative measures like healthcare for people who were, by definition, out of the workforce, children and the elderly. So the idea was if you give people the tools they need to capture that prosperity, they'd help themselves out of poverty.
You talk about, in the context of qualitative liberalism, the Office of Economic Opportunity and its Community Action Program, which was certainly
Right.
controversial. Remind us about that. Bring back that memory
Sure.
too.
What's really great about this era is that there were people in the White House who took ideas seriously, right? So there were a bunch of holdovers from the Kennedy administration who had been really fascinated by experiments that had been running on the ground in a number of cities. A lot of them had been funded by the Ford Foundation. There was this idea that, it was perfectly in harmony with this opportunity theory ethos, that if you also gave poor people the tools to sort of exert more power in their own communities, they could help themselves. So if you had poor people in a neighborhood in Lower Manhattan or in Rochester who needed things that they weren't getting, like regular trash pickup that would keep their neighborhoods clean, or their fair share of municipal jobs, because entire neighborhoods would have been written off by the political machine if they weren't of the right race or ethnicity. Maybe they needed more input into their children's community schools. Well, the way to help them do that was to organize them. So one of the ideas behind the community action programs that were part of Johnson's War on Poverty was that you would literally give government funding to local community groups if they came up with a plan and a prospectus, and they were essentially there to organize poor people. And where this became enormously controversial as early as 64 and 65 is that many of these poor people who were being organized by the community action programs were using that money to form community action programs, were then going out and really causing trouble for the urban political machines that the Democratic Party, both at the state level and nationally, relied on. So the White House was receiving dozens of complaints from big city and small city urban mayors who were Democrats, saying, like, you guys are paying a bunch of poor people to go register voters to knock me out in next year's primary. Why are you doing that? So
Didn't Johnson appreciate that this was the direction the policy would take? He's such a sophisticated and shrewd politician. He embraced community action. He embraced maximum feasible participation. Did he miss where this was going to take him?
He thought that the way that this was going to shake out, his understanding of it originally was that you would probably have the urban machines themselves either enjoy a seat at the table or actually direct the flow of money. He once said to Moyers, Bill Daley knows how to run Richard Daley rather knows how to run a voter registration project better than a bunch of these guys from this awful neighborhood in South Chicago. So he had it wrong, but what's interesting is that he never killed it, and he knew it was creating problems for him. And he certainly was getting a lot of pressure to withdraw the money, but he never did.
Interesting. So that was one of the, to use your term, landmines that Johnson perhaps didn't entirely appreciate when he was pursuing the Great Society. Were there others?
There certainly were. I think he didn't anticipate the way in which race would trip things up. I mean, what's interesting is that when Johnson's staff members, when his cabinet, when liberal policymakers generally were thinking about poverty, they were thinking a lot about white poverty in the early 60s. I mean, that was the face of it. If you look at the literature, the sort of popular literature on poverty in the early 60s, it was the face of the coal miner. It wasn't the face of an African American living in a depressed urban neighborhood or working as a sharecropper in Mississippi. That was part of the conversation, to be sure, but that wasn't really the face of it. And these programs, on a pure numbers basis, certainly did more to alleviate white poverty than black poverty, in the sense that most of the recipients of programs like Medicaid and Head Start were white. But because his administration had proved so avid in its enforcement of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, particularly in areas that intersected with other Great Society programs, it became easy to caricature these programs as minority handouts and giveaways. And that's exactly what happened in 1966 when you saw that first wave of political backlash.
Yeah. Although it's interesting, I like the fact that you call attention to the threat of a racial backlash in 1964.
Mm-hmm.
George Wallace is making noises about running for the presidency. Johnson's own polling and other indicators show deep reservation in white working class communities about the Great Society. So, and Johnson understood the fault line in American politics around race. He was certainly no stranger to that. How did he propose to navigate this fault line? How did he propose to work his way around racial division without letting it swallow his agenda?
Yeah, you're absolutely right about 64. I mean, it even stunned people in the White House when Wallace performed so well in states like Wisconsin. It shocked them, particularly in these white ethnic neighborhoods. I think he was certainly conscious of backlash. I guess the way I'd answer this is to say that one of the things that I find admirable about him is that he was keenly aware that he had a certain amount of political capital, and he understood that he was going to draw it down over time. He understood that enforcement of civil rights laws and enforcement of desegregated hospitals and nursing homes, which came out of the Medicare Act, of schools, that was going to draw down that capital much more quickly. Early in his presidency, one of his aides said, why would we want to go so immediately on the Civil Rights Act? This is, you are extremely popular now in the aftermath of the assassination. This is going to be very difficult. And he said, reportedly said, well, what the hell is the presidency for? Meaning, you use the capital for things that are important to you. And he was very clear with his aides that he understood that, the things they were doing on race were going to draw down that capital. I think he felt that he could always stay a step ahead, and certainly thought that he could count on the machines to deliver the votes when he needed them. I don't think he anticipated just how bad the backlash would get.
But he did have a window of opportunity after 1964 because he had this enormous congressional majority. And one of the most significant things about that election is that it produced a Democratic majority in Congress in which, for the first time, the majority of Democrats in Congress weren't from the South. And that changed the dynamic in the Democratic Party. He then proceeded on a wave of legislation. What do you think were the most significant things that he did in that period, 1965, 1966? The most significant and the most lasting accomplishments?
Sure. I mean, they're often the same. I mean, the Voting Rights Act comes to mind immediately, right? You can't imagine this country without the Voting Rights Act, although there are certain people who I think would like to imagine it. Some of the most lasting, the programs that have had the most lasting effect include the bill that provided for the first time ever meaningful federal aid to primary and secondary schools. Now, its effect is threefold. First of all, it created a funding source that's durable to this day and has only grown over time for primary and secondary schools. And there are school districts where federal funds now comprise, upwards of 20 or 30% of the total budget. So that's obviously meaningful. There's been some debate, or considerable debate, about whether money matters, about whether these funds, particularly Title I funds, which are supposed to follow poor children and not be, follow a particular school necessarily, whether they've actually been used for the correct purposes and whatnot. But I think most reasonable people would agree that if you withdrew, 30% of a school district's budget, it would be in crisis. So change the way we fund education in a way that benefits, less prosperous municipalities. Second, it involved the federal government for the first time ever in public education. Whether you like that, whether you don't, it never gave the government carte blanche to go in and rewrite a school curriculum in the way that conservatives then and now claim it did. But it would be disingenuous to say that it didn't create some federal influence over what goes on in schools. And the third thing is that it provided an enormous carrot that the Johnson administration used to desegregate schools both in the South and the North. After the Civil Rights Act, it became much easier for the Department of Justice to sue school districts that had refused to comply with Brown versus Board, the decision in Brown v. Board. And they did that aggressively. That was the stick. The carrot was the money. You could go to these school districts and say, right, you don't get this money unless you show us meaningful desegregation. And it's incredible, to our earlier discussion, the extent to which Johnson, A, supported that and gave his approval to it, and imprimatur, and B, involved himself. There are these great stories about how these officials from the Office of Education, there was no Department of Education in those days, but the Office of Education commissioner would do his weekly meeting with Joe Califano in the basement of the West Wing. Califano had this sweeping set of offices, and Johnson would wander in and out looking at school district maps, looking at targets, and he knew which districts hadn't met their September targets yet for 1965, and he would say, get them, get the last ones. He was deeply involved in it. So that has a lasting effect, and you can see the numbers. They change dramatically over the next 20 years, which is largely because of that act.
Well, one other bill we should talk about is Medicare, because as an achievement, not just a legislative achievement, but as a practical administrative achievement, it was quite remarkable how quickly the Johnson administration was able to get that program up and running.
Yeah, if you think about the trouble that the Obama administration encountered in standing up the Affordable Care Act after it had passed the House and Senate, it's remarkable to think that the administration essentially created Medicare and Medicaid from the ground up in 11 months. That meant that they had to go out and enroll upwards of 19 million senior citizens, educate them about their benefits, explain to them that they would have to pay for the elective health care piece, that the hospital care was free. They had to go out and find them. This is a pre-computer age. They were using punch cards, but they used every federal agency from the Park Service to the post office in order to find and register 19 million people. They got 19 million of them to agree to voluntary deductions from their Social Security checks to pay for the optional insurance, which is incredible. They had to go sign agreements with insurance carriers who were going to administer the program, because that's always how it was done. They had to get hospitals and nursing homes compliant, and they did all this in 11 months, and they were desegregating thousands of hospitals and nursing homes throughout the South, because the same logic applied. They went in and said, if you're not desegregated, and that was floor by floor, ward by ward, room by room, if you don't hire African-American healthcare professionals, if you don't publicly advertise in your community newspapers that you are now open for business for Black patients, and if we find you're violating any of this, because we will be looking, you lose your Medicare eligibility, and none of these hospitals wanted to lose their eligibility to participate. So they managed to do all of this in 11 months, which is an extraordinary thing.
Yeah. You mentioned the Affordable Care Act, and you mentioned that, which brings to mind Barack Obama as a president. One of the criticisms that one heard about Barack Obama was that, unlike Johnson, for example, he didn't schmooze with members of Congress. He didn't have dinner with them. He wasn't sociable in that respect. I guess in that way, in some ways, he was more like Kennedy, who was also standoffish when he was in the White House. And yet, you also alluded to this earlier, Johnson's reputation as a legislative magician is in some ways overblown. And it's fair to ask, really, is it a matter of a president's personality when it comes to legislation, or is it really a matter of how large his majority is in Congress? When you have a majority as big as Johnson had in 1965 and 66, you should be able to push through major legislation.
Yeah, I think it's more the latter. I mean, he was certainly good at it and enjoyed doing it in a way that neither Kennedy nor Obama did. But he didn't have he had large majorities rather than in 8 years, I think President Obama enjoyed both chambers, Democratic control of both chambers for 2 years. And he also didn't have the kind of trenchant opposition other than to civil rights, although one could argue that a good deal of the Southern opposition essentially folded, and they found other ways to express and live their opposition that weren't openly in violation of the law. But I mean, he didn't have that kind of opposition. Nobody took him to court after Medicare and Medicaid passed to try to stop him from implementing it. They didn't try to repeal it every 5 weeks. So they certainly didn't try to undermine the public's interest in it. I mean, the American Medical Association had been battling Medicare-type legislation for 20 years, and it had spent a fortune doing it. It had been vitriolic in its opposition to the Medicare Act, called it, state-sponsored communism, said that it was Ronald Reagan said that, years later after Medicare passed, he said that, if this happened, you'd have to explain to your children what it was like to live in America when it had been a free society. I mean, it was pretty hyperbolic. But they stopped after the bill passed. They didn't try to sabotage it afterwards. So we're living in a period when politics has gotten much more vicious and winner takes all.
And then for Johnson, after the glorious period, if you will, of 1965 and 1966, it all went sour really very quickly. And we should talk about it, as you do in the third part of the book, briefly. First, the Vietnam War. How did the Vietnam War affect the Great Society?
Well, it did so in a number of ways. First of all, it cracks the liberal coalition in half. There's a period by late 66, early 67 when it was very embarrassing. A whole bunch of prominent college professors, artists, public intellectuals had been invited for some sort of dinner at the White House, and a bunch of them were refusing to come. And, Califano and Harry McPherson were on the phone with these people saying, like, why? We gave you Medicare, Medicaid, public, aid to public education, the Civil Rights Acts, about 500 other things. These are things you've been wanting for years, and only he could deliver them, and did. But their answer was Vietnam. So it cracks that coalition, gives rise to a student movement that creates all sorts of political problems for that coalition. That's one. I think the second piece of it is that it fundamentally strains his credibility with the American people. We forget this now, but it was really Bill Moyers who was unfortunately in the mandatory position, having to go out there, every week and dissemble on behalf of the administration. And what was ultimately called the credibility gap, a term that was coined sometime around 1966. Reporters were also for a time calling it the Moyers gap, because it was no longer credible when the administration was tucking war appropriations within the larger Defense Department budget, but purposely undershooting, and then having to come back for a supplemental appropriations bill of $10 billion 6 months later off of a total budget of $120 billion. It became clear that they weren't leveling, and so it undermined his credibility there. And then the third thing is that it had economic effects that undermined the whole argument and kind of thesis behind the Great Society. So he couldn't ask Congress for a tax increase, or he didn't until 1967. Because if he did, he was afraid that conservatives and moderates would basically demand that he slash funding for the Great Society in order to pay for the war rather than increase taxes. So he didn't want to do that, so he paid for it by borrowing, and that created an inflationary spiral that would be modest by later comparison. I mean, if you were living in 1973, you probably wished you had 1967 inflation. But remember, for 20 years, people had been told that we figured out how to do this. We figured out how to keep inflation at almost zero and continue to grow the economy. So as inflation became an increasing problem for the Johnson administration, it looked like he no longer knew how to pull the levers, control the levers of the economy correctly, which was part of the implicit deal.
Right. And in this time period, after 1966, just to go back to where we started with his aides, many of the key people left the White House. Many left Johnson. Why?
Exhaustion, in large part. I mean, Reedy left out of physical exhaustion and just pure exhaustion. There's a guy named Horace Busby who's a really fascinating character. Busby had worked on and off as a Senate aide to Johnson, and then went out and did very well in the private sector and came into the White House in '64. But his routine with Johnson was that he could take him for about 1.5 years or 2 years, and then he just couldn't take him. And they had a nice relationship. They seemed to hold each other harmless for these things, but he couldn't stand it anymore, so he left. The real mystery is why Johnson fell out with Bill Moyers, which happened sometime in late 1966. The standard story, which is probably in some respects true, is that a rift had come between them over the issue of Vietnam. I think that can be over-exaggerated sometimes. Valenti later said, he was at a dinner party in '68, sitting next to Arthur Schlesinger, who hated Johnson, and said, and essentially said, it's a tragic that Moyers is out because he was the only dove in the White House. And Valenti said that's ridiculous. He held the same position that everybody else had, at least until early '67. But that might have been one of the pieces of it. But I think Johnson also was beginning to tire of Moyers developing his own kind of outsized personality, right? I mean, he was getting tired of reading articles that described Bill Moyers as the conscience of the White House, or the good angel on Johnson's shoulder, or sort of talking up his religious piety and his better instincts. I mean, implicit in this was that if not for Moyers, Johnson would be a total monster. So the two of them had a falling out. They didn't really repair that breach.
So it's not new then to have these aides with enormous egos who want to cultivate their own image in the press, a la Steve Bannon. This is something that goes back a long way.
Yeah, I mean, and being press secretary is a very dangerous job because by definition you are extremely visible. And Moyers probably played it a bit close to the sun, too much for his own good.
Yeah.
But in some respects he couldn't be helped. He was warned that this was what was going to happen when he became press secretary, but he took the job anyway.
Yeah. I suppose we should close our conversation by talking about the legacy of the Great Society. What were its most lasting positive impacts on the United States?
Sure. You draw back and you look at the way that conservatives have sort of caricatured the Great Society over the last 30-some years. They've caricatured it as being an experiment in state, almost Soviet-style statism. It's seen as being a left-wing, highly redistributionist type European socialist-style program, when in fact it was actually quite moderate and born of a very moderate set of assumptions. You can criticize certain components of it, but it's kind of unimaginable to take it all away. The way that we measure poverty in the U.S. is on a cash basis, but if you do an alternative, there's an alternative way to measure poverty whereby you factor in the cash value of some of the non-cash benefits like Medicaid, Medicare, school lunches and reduced price and free school lunches and breakfast for poor children and the like. SNAP, which was born as food stamps, which was a pilot, and then Johnson turned it into a permanent program. If you do that, the poverty rate dropped about 26%. And if you take it all away, presumably the poverty rate shoots up, at least by that measure. But I think even on a non-qualitative or quantitative basis, it's really hard to imagine a world without Head Start. Really hard to imagine exactly how we would be providing senior citizens and very poor people. 130 million people rely on Medicare and Medicaid. So I don't know exactly what you would do if you took those away, but that's about 40% of the country. 30 million children rely on it for food assistance in school. 20 million families rely on it for SNAP. As we talked about, schools rely on it for funding. There are a whole host of environmental protections that got introduced as well. PBS, NPR were born from the Public Broadcasting Act in '68. It's hard to imagine America without those things, and it's almost impossible to fathom a country in which African Americans are barred, or other minorities are barred access to public accommodations, schools, hospitals, nursing homes. But what's interesting is that all of these things, like every single one of these things today, is under assault.
I think that's a good note for us to open up to the audience. So let me just say, as I go around, we're going to ask you to wait for the microphone. Who has you have the microphone? We're going to ask you to wait for the microphone and speak into the microphone. And although I can't tell you not to make comments, I do want you to end with a question that our author can answer. Okay, so the microphone. Let's start in the far back there, right there. Yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for doing this. Clearly there was something that attracted you to this subject, and you may have come in with some strong views and beliefs about Johnson. What I'd love you to talk about a little bit is, once you got into the subject, was there any strong view you had when you began that you really came out 180 degrees different about it?
180 degrees.
150, 125. It's just
Yeah. I think we think of him as being a preternaturally good politician, and he was better than 99% of them, but he was fallible, and I think we alluded to this earlier. He really did not anticipate the intense kind of backlash that he would face and the way in which different pieces of it would come together. Some of it he could not possibly have anticipated. There was something generational going on, not just in the United States, but everywhere, as the baby boom generation came of age. So I don't know that anybody could have anticipated that, but he really did, I think, fundamentally misread the appetite for civil rights in the North. To his credit, he didn't draw back after it became clear. But I think he always felt he could stay a step ahead of that backlash, and I don't think he realized the firestorm that he was unleashing. That was one. And I think the second piece is that it's standard narrative that the way in which public faith in our institutions and leaders has eroded over the years began to erode because of Vietnam and because of Watergate. That's certainly true, and that's not like I didn't know that in theory going into this, but the sheer dissemblance on Vietnam was pretty profound, and I think you have to, when I looked anew at some of the public polling, really the faith in institutions had already kind of fallen precipitously by the time Watergate happened. So I think he bears a pretty big responsibility for that.
Okay. Let's come up here.
Hi, yes. I have a quick point to make before my question. I noticed that you said when we were, and by we I mean the country, was discussing the Medicare Act, there was a firestorm of reactionary rhetoric. And I noticed when you said this that this seems to be a very commonplace tactic that the alt-right uses. There's actually a series on it called the Alt-Right Playbook. I'm wondering how you think, in this modern age of telecommunications and free-flowing money, we can obfuscate that rhetoric without succumbing to, and move forward in pushing the Great Society plan that Lyndon Johnson envisioned, which has never really been realized, without succumbing to what's the term I'm looking for? Reactionary rhetoric of our own.
I mean, that's bringing me a little far from my comfort level. I mean, let me try to answer that in a way that brings it back here. What's interesting about this period is that it's unrecognizable today. So I don't think Lyndon Johnson would be president today in this environment. I don't think he could have won an election. I don't think he had that flair, and I don't think he could have actually constructed nobody's figured out how to do it, but he couldn't have constructed a response in this climate to that playbook. He didn't have that capacity to work I mean, he was a pretty bad television president in an era when there were just 3 networks. So I don't know how to answer. It's a really good question, one that I'll ponder. I think though it really draws into sharp relief the profound differences between the era in which he governed and the era in which we're having this conversation
But
today.
when you say that, you leave the impression that in some ways this era is worse, and maybe that is so. But it's worth remembering there was far more domestic violence in 1967 and 1968 than there is today. It was the tension splitting the country. Remember the assassinations, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy. The country seemed at that time to be coming apart violently, and although there's some talk about this today, I would argue that when you look at the street demonstrations and the climate then, it was significantly worse than it is now.
Oh, I agree with that. I mean, there were thousands of bombings on campuses in 1968 and 69 alone. I think I meant the way that electoral politics operates and the way media has influenced it.
Certainly the parties are much more polarized today. Johnson could get cooperation from moderate Republicans in his era, and he had some trouble with Southern Democrats. But today, it's virtually impossible for a president of one party to get significant cooperation from the other. So the division between the political parties, there's almost no overlap today between the wings of the parties that there was then. There was a conservative Democratic wing then that overlapped with conservative Republicans. There was a liberal Republican wing then that doesn't exist. There are no, and today, if you look at Congress, the most conservative Democrat is still more liberal than the most liberal Republican by most voting indexes. We can talk later. Let me move the microphone. Let's go over to this side.
What influence did Lady Bird Johnson have, if any, with her husband and his administration?
A good deal, actually. It's a great question. They had a very complicated relationship, and as difficult as he was to work for, I'm quite sure he was 10 times more difficult to be married to. But she could speak with him very frankly. She shared his commitment to racial justice. During the '64 campaign, he wrote off the South. I mean, he knew that he was going to lose a bunch of southern states that normally a Democrat, wouldn't lose. And he also knew that the ones he was going to win, he would do better to just not campaign there because of the Civil Rights Act. So he wrote it off. She insisted on doing a whistle-stop tour for about 2 weeks throughout the South. And she was booed, heckled, jeered, stuff was thrown at her. Signs were hoisted that said, "Blackbird, go home." But she gave really forceful speeches in support of the Civil Rights Act throughout the campaign. He met her at the last stop in New Orleans and got up and gave one of his most rousing speeches on civil rights. Yeah, the question is whether she was in favor of his not running again. I think she supported it. I think she wanted out, but I don't think she asked him not to run again. I think she was supportive.
Hang on, I'm sorry, we can't have the back and forth just because we don't have the microphone. Let's come over here into the middle.
Could you say a little about women's rights and how he viewed that and women in administration?
Unfortunately, there's not a lot to say, and as much as like most of the men of his generation, this was not something that was at the front of his agenda. I mean, some of the first strides that had been taken on this had come out of a commission that a 50-state commission that Kennedy impaneled, but again, that was not something that he paid close attention to. Over the course of his career, Johnson had a couple of women on staff, on his personal Senate staff, House staff, White House staff, and he seems to have taken them as seriously as he did any other aide. He had been we're sitting in the Roosevelt House, he had been very close to Roosevelt's White House staff as well as cabinet, and he certainly would have remembered Frances Perkins and her influence with Roosevelt. But women are largely absent from his senior staff and from most senior roles in the departments. He didn't have a woman in the cabinet. It was just absent the agenda. I think this does not become something that Democratic Party elected officials took very seriously until the 1970s.
There are only one or two women advisors that you mention in the book.
Yeah, I mean they're absent, and there's nobody in the inner circle in that way. Lady Bird is the only person who can really have these kinds of conversations with him, and she does.
Okay, let's go here. Wait for the microphone if you don't mind.
Hi. Can you talk to us a little bit about the decision that led to his decision not to run for re-election? It sort of is very bizarre for, I guess, every president you can remember ran for re-election. You mentioned how his coalition started to crumble because of the decisions, the policies he put in place. But what actually happened, Tim, as a alpha male in the White House who craved power? How did he lay down his sword at some point? What went through his mind and his inner circle?
There's no like precipitating event, and there's no one answer to this question. I think to this day, a lot of the people around him to their dying days wonder why he came to that decision. I think he had already in his head gotten there by late '67 because he was very slow to spin up a re-election race. He was being implored by staff members to actually let them start putting together the machinery for a run in '68. He seemed really disengaged on the entire topic. He begrudgingly let them do it, but as early as February, he sort of hinted to Horace Busby, who was no longer working for him, but who he wanted some help. He wanted help on some speeches. He sort of intimated to him in a number of conversations that he was strongly considering not running. I mean, Vietnam had taken it was just taking an enormous toll and drain. He didn't expect to be governing in an era of such incredible tension, violence, social unrest, and he had always been terrified of dying young. All the Johnson men died young of heart attacks, and I genuinely think he thought that this job would kill him.
I just wanted to read something in the book about the 1968, the decision in 1968 when Harry McPherson was writing to Johnson about the presidential race, and he talked about the likely candidates for president. On the Democratic side, Johnson, Eugene McCarthy, Bobby Kennedy. On the Republican side, Rockefeller, Nixon, and George Wallace. And of them, McPherson said that Johnson carried the most political baggage. And the 1968 cycle would culminate in a change election, And Johnson, as the representative of the status quo, was actually the most conservative from that perspective. I read this and I thought about 2016.
Yeah.
It was very strong echoes of 2016 as a change election. And if you're seen as the candidate of the status quo in that kind of election, there's not very much that you can do.
I will say that there have been a bunch of books on Bobby Kennedy and the '68 race that have come out lately. I mean, one thing that I think we tend to overlook is that had Johnson stayed in the race, he most certainly would have been renominated. There was, at that point in time, primaries didn't elect but a small slither of delegates. So there's no way either McCarthy or Kennedy or together that they could have displaced him. So it would have been a Nixon Johnson race.
Okay. Yes, here. Wait for the microphone, please.
Did you work out, at least for yourself, a kind of alternative history if Vietnam had not happened, or if it hadn't happened so intensely? How much greater would the Great Society have been? Or somehow are the two fused, and is it impossible to imagine that alternative history?
I think if it, I mean, we were never supposed to do this in grad school, but why not, right? Like, I think if it had gone that way, right, and let's assume that he had another term, I think the interesting counterfactual to consider is whether this kind of this faith in opportunity theory and qualitative liberalism would have played out. In '67, by '67, it was becoming clear to a lot of people on his staff, particularly McPherson, Sergeant Shriver, that there were just pockets of America where people needed cash and they needed jobs, and the jobs had disappeared. So you could give them all the job training, education, and supplementary food assistance in the world, but that wasn't going to help them get a job. So they entertained all sorts of ideas. Patrick Moynihan, who was then at the Department of Labor, wanted to institute a twice-a-day mail delivery because the Postal Service employed a disproportionate number of African Americans, and his thinking was we could really boost black employment if we went to a two-delivery system in the same way that England did. And they were beginning to look at the idea of a negative income tax. I think in that counterfactual, it's possible, not necessarily a given, but quite possible that the direction of the welfare state and of social policy might have changed, and it might have, particularly if you assume that many of the economic problems that beset Nixon in his first and second terms also would have kicked in: the supply shocks, the inflation, the steady loss of manufacturing jobs. I mean, they couldn't have anticipated, how much we'd shift to a service economy. But if all of that had been happening, I wonder if those voices might not have become more prominent, and if they might have begun to shift their emphasis and their approach to poverty.
I'm not sure that that's entirely a counterfactual, because if you look at what Nixon's approach to poverty was, Nixon did, in fact, do a number of these measures to a quantitative approach to poverty, even as he was winding down the Office of Economic Opportunity. So I think we actually saw some of that under Johnson's successor. Nixon gets trashed for many things, but he does deserve credit for actually having continued as a number of generally liberal economic policies and anti-poverty policies in his administration. We've got time for one more question. We'll take that one back there.
Was his inability to adjust to the unrest in Vietnam caused by the Pentagon having control of the White House? Was that why he couldn't? I mean, here was a guy who could adjust to anything, but he seemed to have been trapped by McNamara and so forth.
It's important to zoom out and remember that there was really no credible person. There were a handful. There was George Ball, the Undersecretary of State. Right. There were one or two voices in Congress who were deep skeptics, but nobody before 1966 of any real credibility was seriously challenging the thinking behind the war. In fact, there was an imperative. I mean, he felt trapped. He knew that if he did pull out, the Republicans would hammer him over it. Nixon would hammer him with blunt force. I mean, this was becomes easy to blame it on Lyndon Johnson in retrospect, but this was prevailing wisdom. I think you know this piece better than I do, but that's my sense.
Yeah, and Johnson, he understood he was trapped. He referred to it as that bitch of a war. That was his expression for Vietnam. He saw no way, and he felt remembering what had happened with Truman when China became communist and the Democrats were blamed for losing China. He didn't think that the Democrats could survive, their programs could survive if he was blamed for losing Vietnam. So it was a mindset that I think very few, if any, Democrats in 1964, 65, or 66 could have completely escaped from the Vietnam conflict. That doesn't mean they would have pursued it as badly as he did. He mishandled it in every way imaginable, but I think it's idle to think that some other Democrat would have done it differently. And I also don't think I would accept the characterization that he was in any way trapped by the Pentagon. There was a much larger constellation of forces in which Johnson fit, and he was operating in Vietnam based on the many larger assumptions about the Vietnam War. There was plenty of generals in the Pentagon didn't care for Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War, and he was prepared to pursue it his way despite that military opposition. I wouldn't blame the generals for that. Well, I want to thank you very much for this conversation.
Great. Thank you.
There will be a reception upstairs, and Josh will be signing copies of his book, and I highly recommend it to you all. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.